people in here. Good morning. There you go. There you go. Wake up. Wake up. We have lunch coming up right after this presentation. What do you all think of the lunch yesterday? Woohoo. Hey, anyone have any of the cannolis? Man, those were decent. Anyways, it is my pleasure to introduce Johnny Shaieb. And I always ask, what are the 3 words that you would like to describe yourself? And he just pointed at one of the bullet points here, so I'm just going to read it right off here. Chief Architect of IBM's Cyber Threat Exposure Management Practice. Cyber Threat Exposure. That is this man. Leading offensive security disciplines like pen testing, adversary simulation, and vulnerability management. So he's an educator, and I love this. Talent developer. So without further ado, Johnny, please regale us.
Testing. All right. How's everybody doing? I can remember maybe 14 years ago at the second Houston SecCon, I got to meet all my hacker heroes. Have any of you ever heard of Metasploit before? H.D. Moore. And so this was at Hotel Derrick. H.D. Moore was there. Have you guys ever heard of R-Snake before? So that's the godfather of cross-site scripting. And also, have you guys ever heard of Iron Geek? So Iron Geek, Adrian Crenshaw, if you guys have ever used the tool, it's either Matilde or Damn Vulnerable Web App. So he was the creator of that. So I always like to compliment and come back to Houston SecCon because it is a great educational place and you just don't know who you're going to see. So anyway, my name is Johnny Shaieb, and a little bit about me. Been at IBM for 22 years, really been in the workforce for 27, 28 years, and I've been teaching ethical hacking for the last 13 years, so I'm at my 108th class, not all of them in ethical hacking, but so anyway, today I'm going to talk to you about really exposure management, but you got to use, a sexy title, what CISOs should know about vulnerability management, to get attention. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the battlefield of exposure management, what it is. It's exhausting. Some new frameworks like CTEM, Continuous Threat Exposure Management, and then kind of the pitfalls. So if I was a director or CISO, what would I look out for? So I already talked a little bit about me, but when I take a class, and I'm a PhD student, my dissertation is basically on vulnerability database history, scoring history, everything you could want to know about vulnerabilities. But I always like to go and, just look at the credibility in a little bit. And in 2017, I was fortunate to work with a gentleman by the name of Steve Osepik, in which we pretty much automated hacker research. And so that was patent number 1, being able to prioritize vulnerabilities according to weaponized intelligence. And that's really how the vulnerability management practice was born at IBM. So this is the common shock and awe slide, the average cost of a data breach, $4 million. And really, this can be attributed to not knowing your digital ecosystem. So you're going to hear a lot about asset management and asset contextualization. But if you really think about the battlefield, it's fundamental across all cybersecurity towers. So common challenges, not knowing your digital footprint, right? And that creates, you have shadow IT versus rogue IT, and basically shadow IT is, if it went through a device activation process, it might get approved, probably. Rogue IT is, if it went through a device activation process, it would never get approved. Either case, the result will be the same if they're compromised. $4.44 million on average to a Fortune 500 company. And then no clear ownership. This is the number one reason of vulnerability backlog by a mile. So we have hundreds of clients and we go and study this. On average, 63% of vulnerability backlog is attributed to not knowing who the owner is. Surprise, surprise. And then, a distant number 2 is end of life, and then a distant number 3 is remediation team scope, limited knowledge on how to fix all the elements of a vulnerability, and then not actually having the cyber hygiene platform to go and fix, just thinking that a native OS platform might be able to fix. So what's the battlefield? Sorry, that was a little bit loud. The battlefield is a digital symphony of zeros and ones, harmoniously communicating across devices, people, process, planes, trains, automobiles, technology stacks, IT, OT, power plants, water plants, nuclear reactors. It's exhausting. And so if I was a CISO, I would step back to understand what is my digital footprint. And this is really where exposure management begins. Being able to identify assets, detect vulnerabilities, determine their business criticality, their contextualization. Across network locations, internal, external, DMZ, that reside on the various different technology stacks of IT, OT, Internet of Things. And last point is what a lot of people don't think about. This is the got you. Is across these technology stacks, how these resource components, how do I access, these devices, whether you're an end user or an application. And so this is an exposure management onion, or your digital ecosystem, or the battlefield. So at the very center, you have your crown jewels, your critical assets, all assets, across those multiple networks, across those technology stacks, and you have a myriad of different ways of accessing those devices. So a lot of us are familiar with servers and networks and web apps, but then in the advent of cloud, containers, your registries, API, OT devices. And so in 2022, Gartner came up with CTEM, Continuous Threat Exposure Management, which was about, and it's very similar to the NIST cybersecurity framework, but it's about going and identifying those assets through scoping, detecting the vulnerabilities through discovery, and prioritizing using not only asset contextualization, but also weaponized intel, and then finally being able to validate those vulnerabilities from a breach attack assimilation point of view, and then being able to mobilize through remediation strategies. Is it anybody familiar with CTEM in here? Kind of show of hands? Few? Yeah. So this is my interpretation. Johnny is not always right. But I did the same thing for NIST many years ago. How do I overlay a exposure management framework on what I really see in the field? So that's basically what this is. So it's a layered cake. Your technology stacks, IT, OT, Internet of Things, resides on the networks, and then you have those resource components. So IT can be operating system, application, database, the same thing for OT. But how do you manage all that? So that's where you get into the scoping piece, the asset inventory. What's near and dear to my heart, if I put it in reverse about 27 years ago, or something like that. Back in 1999, starting as a Unix system administrator, not a Linux, AIX, HP, Solaris. In order to get a device on a data center, you would have to sign in blood. There was actually a real process, right? But then in the advent of virtualization, anybody can stand up anything. And then on top of that, you had cloud, which even made it worse. And so that's why 63% of vulnerability backlog can be attributed to not knowing your asset inventory, your digital footprint. So then it gets into the discovery piece. If you're a CISO in the room, the question to your vulnerability management, exposure management vendor, Johnny, I know what value the technology provides, but what value add do you provide as a service provider? And the answer is asset contextualization. Because contrary to popular opinion, it's not the job of the vulnerability management team to actually fix vulnerabilities. But you could be considered at least responsible to help drive that down. So what do? You tag and bag assets, you create a poor man's database inside your vulnerability platform, and that's how you're able to quickly respond. Johnny, we have Log4j. Tell me all the externally facing devices that are business mission critical. Now, go. And by the way, tell me their owners too. So if you're looking at finding if you're looking at exploring a vendor in vulnerability management, exposure management, that is the number one thing you should ask for. Because switching out a tool is not going to change the outcome. It's the value add of the service provider. And then we have prioritization. So this is really tricky. So there's really not that many vulnerability management platforms anymore that just use the CVSS score. It's a venerated score, but it's a severity-based score. And severity-based score really means, and I got this from Carnegie Mellon, so I'll quote them, but if something were to happen, it would be this big, right? But then you have risk. So risk has, anybody in here have heard of the EPSS score? Yeah, a lot, right? Thank you, Jay Jacobs. Anyway, that actually provides a probability based on multiple sources of threat intel, what the probability of somebody might break in, which is a whole different thing, and that's what you should be using for prioritization. And then the validation piece. So this is really unique to any sort of framework I've seen. So I've been a big proponent of this cybersecurity framework 1.0, 2.0. Got to interview Karen Scarfoni a couple months ago. That was pretty cool. But what Gartner has done is saying, hey man, you need to validate. And you're going to validate through breach attack simulation. So it's not really a pen test, but there's a problem with data fidelity in vulnerability management platforms, and we're going to add in this extra thing to help clear it up. So if you guys have ever heard of Safe Breach, Attack IQ, PICUS, anything like that, so it's like the next step to a penetration test that actually goes and looks at the artifacts of the results. And then we get into remediation governance, their mobilization, their fixing. So in order to have governance, you need to have accountability. And in order to have accountability, you need to have some sort of instrument, aka a ticket, to assign that accountability. But in order to assign a ticket, you need to know who the owner is. So I always go back, and I know it's not a sexy topic at all, but asset inventory. So if you have a vulnerability backlog, I can already tell you the story about your whole company, your risk management. because we know that 63% of vulnerability backlog is attributed to not knowing who the owner is. So there's probably a lot more things that they don't know, right? So exposure management is exhausting. In the green shell, you see all the different resource components. Traditionally, vulnerability management was really 3 prongs. You had your traditional CVE scanning, right? You had your web app scanning or application scanning, CWE. And then you had your policy compliance, security compliance, CIS benchmarks. But how about all these other attack vectors that can be compromised? So registry, for the longest time, that was fun to manipulate. Or running containers, or S buckets, or OT devices. I was doing an assessment a couple months ago, not a penetration test, but a maturity program assessment or a review. People are scared of the word assessment. And I found an internet-connected web app without a password that got me in internally, and I could also control their OT device. Pretty crazy, right? Because they were just monitoring for CVEs. They weren't even scanning for web apps. So moving on, I'm going to borrow from the CI/CD process. We've heard, the warm, fuzzy, intrinsic phrase for the longest time, shifting left. But from an exposure management point of view, you have to push left to action the right way. And that actioning is fixing. But you can never get to the fixing if you don't know who the owner is. So I know it's kind of academic, but there's more to discovery than just pointing a tool at a range and hopefully you will find something. There's asset reconciliation. Taking multiple data sources, merging them together, and finding out where you have coverage. And the discovery point of view. Once you get your traditional vulnerability data, are you just going from the simplistic point of view, I have all these things open and all these things I need to close, or are you actually going and analyzing that data? Oh, out of 100,000 devices, 50,000 of them have a web server running on them. Maybe I should get web application scanning. Or, and this is another thing I forgot to mention too. If any of you guys are getting ready to purchase a vulnerability management platform for millions and millions of dollars, you should ask the vendor this one question. If you have an authenticated scan or you have an agent on the device, can you tell me when that operating system was built? Why? Because I want to be able to detect if people are building dirty servers and putting them on the network that I'm supposed to protect. And if the vulnerability management platform can't do that, don't buy it. Find one that will. Ask me for free, I'll tell you. So then you got the prioritization piece. You know, it's amazing how technology has improved so quickly. Just the other day, everybody was still using the CVSS score, and they would create categories of critical, high, medium, and low, and you could have like 1 million vulnerabilities, and 30% of them were critical, and now you had 300,000 vulnerabilities to deal with, and you didn't know which ones were weaponizable, which ones to fix first. But now, for most vulnerability products, they have, you know, the open source intelligence, they going out to all the different hacker repositories and databases and lists. And then from the validation point of view, agents. Please install agents on devices that are compatible with agents, because I would rather see data every 4 to 6 hours than to have some sort of crazy industry requirement that we're going to only scan once a month. Did you guys know that 123 new CVEs on average come out a day? Is once a month enough? Probably not. And then finally, mobilization. So companies have different financial maturities. So if you're a smaller company and you're not able to buy like the Cadillac of CMDBs, then you find a vulnerability management tool that can ingest multiple data sources that exist now. Not so long ago it didn't, to where you can have a centralized platform where stakeholders can come in and participate. So asset inventory. Again, I know it's not sexy, but it's the most important thing that you can do, even beyond exposure management, risk management. How does it start? With a business continuity plan. What's the first step of a business continuity plan? What is my battlefield? What is my asset inventory, right? So, and again, common sense isn't common, but you have all these different security towers, risk management, change management, IAM, vuln management, incident response, and they all have the same dependency, asset management. So I'm not exactly sure. I have an idea why, because you really don't make money from asset management. So everybody pawns it off and you have siloed towers and everybody's passing the buck. But this is the number one thing you can do, whether you're talking about exposure management or anything management, to understand your battlefield. And if your company is financially mature, what doesn't make sense to me is, let's go and put your asset inventory platform over here, your change management platform over here, and your exception management platform somewhere else. Well, the thing about it is, if you're a CISO and you're going to go take your morning coffee, if you can't figure out in 2 minutes what your key risk indicators and how you're performing against those key risk indicators, you have a problem. And that's really attributed to all these silo towers doing their own thing, not talking to the CTO, not talking to the CISO, not talking to the CIO, and just purchasing their own thing. And the problem is, it's expensive, exhausting, frustrating to go and now hire somebody to write the duct tape and the virtual duct tape and super glue code to merge those things all together. And nowadays, there's plenty of platforms that do it. So if you're a CISO, again, make sure that your asset management and change management are at least on the same platform. Because if you have change management, right, and somebody wants to go and create a ticket to do something, and you can't find that asset, maybe that ticket never gets approved. Or maybe it's in the inventory, but it's not integrated with change management, and you don't have a real way to go and get a change approved because the CI record doesn't exist in ServiceNow, which is another problem. And, well, maybe next time, right? So the battlefield, asset contextualization. So we're talking about dirty servers earlier. So one of the best ways to stop vulnerability backlog is to first stop new bleeding with a device activation process. And I have a flow chart that will show what that looks like. But wouldn't it be cool, backing up 27 years ago when you had to sign in blood to put a device on a raised floor, if that same thing existed today? You would probably wipe out a whole lot of vulnerabilities because devices back then went through a rigorous set of checklists to make sure that they were properly updated, unlike today. I can go out to a lot of clients, a lot of new clients, not my old clients, because we go and we help them create a device activation process. But I can go out to pretty much any new clients. And so Qualys and Tenable have the ability, and I'm not promoting any tools, but Qualys and Tenable have the ability to go and tell you when a system was built, if you have an agent or an authenticated scan. So let's say in the last 30 days, you have a whole bunch of machines that were built, and you see vulnerabilities that are a couple years old. You know, somebody's building dirty devices. And the next check is, well, are they even in the CMDB or the asset inventory? Probably not. So that is a good way to stop vulnerability backlog by going and detecting new bleeding, and your gate is a device activation process. And then we talked about discovery, and I have a picture about that later, but merging, I mean, common sense is not so common. Merging multiple inventory sources from platforms that are rich in inventory. And then what I don't see and what we've started to do in our practice is to actually go and interrogate asset inventory inside of a ServiceNow, inside of a Remedy. Going and, oh, you have 100 records with the status of retired, but they're still checking in to, Rapid7 Qualys Tenable. That could be a problem because that means somebody forgot about them. And then the asset contextualization piece. Again, the biggest value add that a vulnerability exposure management team can do if they're not, internal, if you hire them as a service provider, is contextualizing the asset, creating that poor man's database inside of a vulnerability platform to do what? Eventually enrich a ServiceNow, Remedy, maybe Jira, not really sure, but those are the two big ones that I play with, because now you have the ability, the modules inside of platforms like that to go and now create CI records if they don't exist, or enrich those CI records with those common three things. Because going back to it, CISO question, Log4j came out. Tell me all the externally facing devices that are business mission critical. Go. And if you can answer those three questions and who the owners are, then at least you don't have to spend like all Christmas vacation. That really sucked. All Christmas vacation going out, from client to client to client. So this is a good way to proactively stay ahead. And then culturally, the mandate. Either the CISO or CIO mandate of making sure that asset inventory is updated. And then the governance piece. Again, with governance, you have to have accountability. With accountability, you have to establish it through an instrument. That instrument's a ticket, but you can't assign a ticket if you don't know who the owner is. That's kind of how that works. This is a device activation process. And maybe this is how it was kind of in the old days, but you would create this ticket to get approval, and upon approval, you would go and build that device with a golden image. And I know we have updates now, but for some reason, some clients don't update their devices, but just hang on with me, play with me. So you build your device with a golden image. And now, moving to the scanning pillar, depending what it has, traditional vulnerability, system hardening with policy compliance, does it have apps? But the point is, you need to scan it 10 ways a Sunday. Find its vulnerabilities. And once you do that, make sure that the proper tickets are open up to the teams. But really the most important piece of this picture is the left side. Right? That you have a fully decorated CI record. It's in ServiceNow or Remedy or whatever. Has the proper assignment groups, network location, asset criticality, and you have a clean bill of health. Kind of sounds like audit compliance, or that's the world that I came from. But again, common sense isn't so common, but this is the number one way of changing culture in like a Fortune 500 client. Is, do you have a device activation process? No, I don't. Well, let me help you with that. And then you work with their ServiceNow engineers. So I'm not promoting ServiceNow. I just see a lot of ServiceNow in the field, right? You work with their engineers to create these workflows that can integrate with any one of these tools and game on. So this is a new type. It's not really a new type of discovery, but it's common sense discovery. Again, platforms that are rich in asset inventory need to feed in to some sort of centralized asset management, change management repository. Hopefully they're, on the same platform. But it's amazing what you can find, from all these tools. I mean, contrary to popular opinion, just because somebody opens up the firewall doesn't mean you're going to be able to discover things. And, for some of the legacy clients out there, there might be firewalls that you don't know about, but these other tools might have reach into. And so that's kind of why I separated out from your traditional IT scanning, OT scanning, DAS, SaaS, hygiene tools. And then you have like the remediation team inventory. That's really important too. A nice trick with that is, and it's part of an assessment I do as well, is I'll go out to each of the remediation teams and I'll take their inventory and I'll ask the vulnerability scan team, is this in your footprint? Yes or no. For a major car manufacturer, about a year and a half ago, I found 3,000 devices that another vendor was supposedly taking care of that wasn't part of their scan footprint. That might be a problem, right? So how do you know they're really fixing everything? Because again, another contrary to popular opinion, there's a big difference, and for those that might be falling asleep, there's a big difference between vulnerability remediation and patch management. Big difference. So if you think about how vulnerability scan tools work, they will club together multiple CVEs into a vulnerability ID. So like Eternal Blue, I think there was like 6 or 7 CVEs, or MS-15, 11, a couple CVEs, registry edits, all sorts of things. But the point is that native operating system tools, SCCM, Intune, Red Hat, Satellite, whatever, WSUS, whatever, doesn't have the ability to go and fix all the elements and map that to a vulnerability ID. And that's why tools like platforms like Qualys with the Avante engine, or Tanium with the Adaptiva engine now have the ability as a cyber hygiene tool to go and fix all the elements of a vulnerability. And what's cool about that too, and I'm kind of going off script, but what's cool about that too, they also have the ability to orchestrate. What does that mean? Wouldn't it be cool to, upon detection of a vulnerability, using its asset criticality, its prioritization, saying, hey man, we're going to cut tickets for things that are really meaningful. And it goes into a ServiceNow. And upon approval of somebody clicking change, now Tenable, now Qualys has the ability to go in and fix. That's pretty special, and that's where we are. But you can't do that if your company actually practices, ITIL best practices of change management. That's never going to happen. So that's why it's really important to be able to merge all these multiple data sources, put them into a centralized repository, and start contextualizing them. Reconciliation, no big deal here, but just kind of an example of what do we know? what's in our CMDB, Vuln platform, and network platform. And what's missing, like in our CMDB and network platform that's not being scanned and vice versa. And what's neat about, some of these tools that I mentioned, that's now a possibility. It can actually do that. But I think a lot of times we're looking at the new whiz-bang thing, hey, AI, machine learning, but we don't go back to the basics to understand our battlefield. So, vulnerability prioritization, how am I doing on time?
It's 11:36.
Okay, so I'm close. So I'll speed through this. So we already talked about there's a difference between severity and risk. And nowadays, most vulnerability platforms will be able to go out to all 25 different exploit repositories and being able to quantitatively tell you what is the worst thing to go after. But the contextualization piece, if you can merge that into some of those platforms that I mentioned, that's how you really go about driving down risk. The risk that keeps the CISO up at night. So this is a little bit old. This is from 2024. But I wanted to point out something. So this represents 245 CVEs, a little bit more. And if you notice, 26% of them are weaponized. So over here in the red, which means that a very large percentage, 73%, are not weaponized. So in the old days, when you used to use a CVSS score that sort of looked at weaponization but really didn't, it's very subjective. It wasn't quantitative, it was qualitative. You might be fixing a lot of the things in the gray area over a lot of things in the red. Case in point, MS17010, Eternal Blue, Eternal Champion. Does anybody remember the CVSS version 2 score? It was a 9.3. But wait, Johnny, how about with version 3? It's even worse, it's an 8.6. And that's with a severity score. So that's the power of using weaponization to actually, so in the picture to the far right, whenever you use a severity score, a bucketed score of critical, high, medium, and low, it's very difficult to go and figure out what is the most important thing to fix. But when you start adding in weaponization, network location, asset criticality, what do? You shove down the noise and you push up risk, but what you're really doing is transforming that building structure of severity data into a risk appetite pyramid. So the building structure is severity, and the risk appetite pyramid is risk. Two separate pieces of data. And so this is an example where you have 42,000 vulnerabilities. And if you use the philosophy of CVSS version 7, or not version 7, a score of 7 or higher being critical, that's still 37% of the vulnerabilities. That's still a ton of vulnerabilities to go fix, almost 16,000. But, and this is where, the patent comes in. And now, technology, they all do the same thing, which is really great. But now you can get within less than 1%. Through the eyes of a threat actor, I would rather go and fix 68 vulnerabilities as opposed to 16,000 vulnerabilities. So that's why prioritization is so important. So remediation governance, and then we'll open it up in the questions. So above is the model of, wouldn't it be cool? You have this urgent vulnerability, and you identify the owner, and you establish accountability by creating the ticket. It gets approved, and things just get fixed. That would be cool. But the three main, and there's more, but the three main causes when we have studied this is it's always been about the asset owner. So if you're a new CISO, and by the way, the average lifespan of a CISO, according to Carnegie Mellon, is really 17 months. So what does CISO try to do? In some cases, they go and try to change, creating their own legacy. Let's switch out this tool for that tool. But really, you need to understand your digital ecosystem, the battlefield, before you do that. And then you have your exclusions. And then you also have the remediation scope of we only fix OS only type of thing. So I am going to kind of fast forward here, but this is what good looks like. This is what you take the picture, the money shot, if you will, because it provides the ecosystem of vulnerabilities automatically going, and I'm not promoting any of these tools, automatically going into tools that I see every day, like a ServiceNow, SecOps, VR, PA. Tickets are automatically assigned according to customized rules. And then the stratified remediation approach, use a cyber hygiene tool first to get the low-hanging fruit, what it can't fix. Use a native OS platform, what it can't fix. That's where you get your manual installation. And then ultimately, you have a dashboard in which all stakeholders are able to get to. Wow, 45 minutes went quick. Does anybody have any questions?
Any questions?
Sure.
What are some
Sorry.
So we have to get it. I'll be.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
We have to get it on mine. Otherwise, it won't come out on the video.
what are some metrics you'd like to show executive board members who want to get away from the CVSS scores and vulnerability backlogs?
So I was asked a couple days ago, we were responding to an RFI, and they go, Johnny, tell me what KPIs we should be looking at. And I responded back, well, what KRIs are you wanting to measure? So the thing about it is I can come up with the most whiz-bang performance indicators, but let's kind of parse through it. So you have key risk, which means you're reactive, and key performance means you're proactive. So like for me, if you're looking at vulnerabilities in general, mean time to respond, how quickly was I able to assign a ticket, and then mean time to remediate, how long did it take him to fix? And so that's where we start with. But folks that are just concerned with open and close, like I said, 123 vulnerabilities come on average per day. That is not what you want to look at.
Thank you for the talk. I just wanted to ask a question about that single pane of glass. All right, so we've got quite a few of the pieces in place. So getting that 2-minute CISO coffee, getting your KPIs, that single pane of glass, or to get that contextualization. If you don't want to say it now, I can talk to you after, but what are some recommendations or vendors that would be good for that?
Let's talk after.
Yeah, will do.
I'm sure everyone wants to hear that, though.
I mean, by way of inference, I named a few, but you know, like so part of my PhD is going and reviewing who's who of vulnerability database and scoring history. And if you go back to the Birds of the Feather meeting, you know, back with Dr. Dave Mann, Spafford, Stephen Christie, you should go and look at the list of the folks that were present. And some of them are some of the major vulnerability providers that you see today.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much, Johnny. Everyone, come on, let's hear it. Come on.